5 Principles of Safeguarding CUI During the CUI Lifecycle. This is part of our CUI Fundamentals series. Use of the content is authorized for individual corporate use only and strictly limited within the CMC EPU terms and conditions. DTC Global, copyright 2022, all rights reserved. So, as we walk through this series, the prerequisite to this course is the CUI Fundamentals course. That creates a foundation for you to understand your responsibilities related to the roles as an authorized holder, whether that's as an organization or as an individual in performance of your contract. The second part of this is as you build familiarity with our content, you'll understand that we provide lots of content. It's usually always cited. Therefore, you have a strong connection between what we're telling you and in each of the slides and that relationship to what's actually written wherever the source of the citation is included. So pause the video right now, go grab a cup of coffee, take a deep breath, and get ready to learn. Because pay careful attention to detail and make sure you are an active learner as you walk through these slides. That'll help you to navigate the concepts. It'll help you to keep things coherent. And don't hesitate to just pause the video and then replay it. Go back and make sure that you understand the concepts because they are progressive. And just like climbing a mountain, one progressive concept builds upon another. And with that, my name is Reagan Edens, and I am the Chief Transformation Officer for DTC Global. And I've literally spent my entire adult life in service to our nation, but principally focused in the cybersecurity space and since 2006. And then being honored, really, to be selected as a founding member on the CMC Accreditation Body Board of Directors. So since then, we have moved forward and established the CMC Industry Standards Council in order to provide the absolute most reliable and accurate information to help you understand these requirements, help you make good decisions about meeting these requirements, and then moving forward and getting focused back on your products and services. So the purpose of today's training is to provide a foundation for understanding your responsibilities for safeguarding CUI during the CUI lifecycle. And the learning objectives we're focused on is the ability to identify and apply those 5 during the safeguarding portion of the CUI lifecycle. Okay. Now, the CUI lifecycle is composed of 4 different components. And those components are identifying CUI, safeguarding CUI, sharing CUI, and decontrolling CUI. Those are important because when we looked at the CUI Fundamentals course and began to build a foundation on identifying CUI, that's the critical portion of the CUI lifecycle because we can't safeguard it until we identify what CUI is and the category that CUI belongs to. So when we focus in on the safeguarding portion as we are today, then that continues that foundation moving forward. And what do we need to do next as we meet responsibilities related to the requirements? And we'll touch on sharing CUI, decontrolling CUI just lightly within this section of the course. So safeguarding CUI within the CUI lifecycle is the principal focus of today's discussion. During implementation, during operations, and in preparation and during assessments and audits. The reason why this is so important is because we want to be prepared to meet the DFAR 7012 requirements in relationship to safeguarding CUI, of course. We want to meet the requirements related to the DFAR 7020 in having an accurate and reliable SPRS score, and we want to meet the upcoming and pending requirements related to CMMC. It's always important to remind you that the dog that wags the tail is the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 current requirements for safeguarding CUI and the SPRS requirements because that impacts your current eligibility in order to execute a contract, in order to award the performance of a subcontract in relationship to DoD work. So the pending CMMC requirements are important, but they're only important because we're focused on the beginning with the end in mind. But the reality is that we have to stay laser focused on meeting the current requirements underneath DFAR 7012 and DFAR 7020. Why this training matters is very important because we share a mutual obligation within our mission to protect the sensitive defense information that's unclassified and protect it wherever it flows in performance of the contract. That goes from our prime contractor all the way down to our first tier 1, all the way down to tier 27, tier 72. Wherever that information flows, we have the obligation to protect the confidentiality and to prevent the misuse and the unauthorized disclosure of controlled and classified information and federal contract information, because we're bound both contractually and we have a moral obligation because we're protecting our national security interests. We're legitimately protecting our families and our children and our grandchildren as we perform these contracts and protect this information from unauthorized disclosure. 5 principles for safeguarding CUI start with identifying all the CUI and determining the requirements. Once we determine the requirements, we can understand what those security requirements are asking of us. What do we need to do to protect the CUI that we have, that we receive, or that we develop in performance of the contract based on the requirements related to that category? And then we apply the CUI security controls or the CMC practice. Now let's touch on a couple key issues from our CUI fundamentals course. Remember that CUI is information that the government creates or processes, or that an entity, that be you, as a contractor or a subcontractor or a sub-subcontractor, creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government. We're talking about the DoD in this instance. That a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency, that's the DoD, to handle using safeguarding and dissemination controls. And the DoD requires you to implement these safeguarding and handling dissemination controls in relationship as you are contractually bound from prime contractor all the way down to the subcontractor to the lowest tier subcontractor in that contractual obligation to implement these requirements and safeguard the CUI. So it's always created or received on behalf of the DoD. And that, remember that CUI may or may not be properly marked. It may not be marked at all. But if the information qualifies as CUI, regardless of whether it's properly marked, then we must meet our obligations related to those requirements, as we learned in the CUI fundamentals course. So now we're going to learn about the 5 principles for safeguarding CUI. And these principles we're going to apply to the controlled and classified information that we receive in performance of the contract or we develop in performance of the contract. We have the responsibility, number 1, to identify all the CUI that's in our environment, whether received or developed, and determine what those requirements are related to the type of and category and subcategory of CUI that we have. Now that we've identified the CUI and we've determined the requirements based on the category, we have to understand what those CUI security requirements are asking of us to implement in order to safeguard the CUI according to the federal requirements. Those are the laws, the regulations, and government-wide policies that are applicable to that specific category of CUI. So let's start getting our arms around what the Department of Defense expects of us in order to protect and safeguard the CUI within our environment. And we start with the 5 principles for safeguarding CUI. Number 1 is that we have to identify all CUI and determine the requirements. Number 2 is we have to understand the CUI security requirements and be able to apply those to the CUI security controls and the practices across our entire environment, whether that's in the physical or that's in the logical, right? Within our network or within our manufacturing environment or within our workspace. We have to be able to ensure that those CUI security controls or the CMC practices are implemented correctly, they are operating as intended, and they're producing the desired outcome. What is that desired outcome? That desired outcome is that we have to satisfy or meet the CUI security requirements that we learned about in step number 2. And then we have to be able to provide an evidence that proves that we're doing it. As always, an important reminder is that if we do steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, but we don't have the sufficient evidence to prove it, then it's as if we haven't done it at all. We will not meet requirements. So the evidence of demonstrating the fact that we can and we do is everything in execution of the requirements. So who's responsible for applying these 5 principles of safeguarding CUI to our environment? Well, that's us, because we are authorized holders by definition underneath 32 CFR. Remember that an authorized holder, as we learned from the CUI fundamentals course, is an individual or an organization or group of users that is permitted to designate or handle CUI in accordance with 32 CFR. So we have to fulfill our responsibilities as an authorized holder, apply these 5 principles for safeguarding CUI to our environment so that we can meet all the responsibilities related to those requirements. So let's begin to apply these 5 principles for safeguarding CUI to our responsibilities across the CUI lifecycle. So remember, we are bound by contractual obligation underneath the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause when we have a contract from the prime contractor all the way down to the lowest tier subcontractor because of the responsibilities related to covered defense information. And we're going to refresh our memory on what the exact definition of covered defense information includes, because that has an important impact and influence on us as we navigate our responsibilities to identify CUI, safeguard CUI prior to sharing CUI in order to meet the requirements. So the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012 gives us a definition for covered defense information because we have the responsibility for safeguarding that covered defense information. So let's take a close look at that definition, and then we're going to break that definition down into the parts and components that are going to impact us as we navigate our responsibilities throughout the CUI lifecycle. Covered defense information is defined as unclassified controlled technical information or other information as is described in the CUI registry that require safeguarding or dissemination controls pursuant to and consistent with laws, regulations, and government-wide policies. Number 1, it's marked or otherwise identified in the contract. Task order, delivery order are provided to the contractor by or on behalf of the DoD in support of the performance of the contract. Or, number 2, it is collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, and stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of the performance of the contract. So let's break that down. So now breaking down the definition for covered defense information even further, we always look at the usual suspect, which is controlled technical information. And by the focus of the DFARS 7012, that's the principal type or category of CUI that we are most likely often to see. There's certainly other categories of CUI that we could receive or that we could develop in performance of the contract. But it's most important that we understand controlled technical information, its definition, and the attributes of that information that we learned in the CUI Fundamentals course so that we are very clear as we begin to navigate from all the different categories of CUI that we could be receiving and all the different categories of CUI that we could actually be developing in performance of the contract. Now, the CUI, again, is going to be marked or identified in the contract, or the CUI could be unmarked information that qualifies as CUI. Well, why is that? That's because we collect and develop and receive and transmit and use and store CUI in performance of the contract underneath the second part of the covered defense information definition. So the DoD has given us guidance on what to do if the information is not marked. We should go back to our prime contractors or go back to our higher tier subcontractors. But usually at the speed of business, that's not really practical. So in order to meet our responsibilities, we need to arm and equip ourselves with a knowledge on how to properly identify CUI and then how to identify what those security requirements are related to safeguarding that CUI by the category. So looking at the first category, controlled technical information, right, because that's our usual suspect. Now we look at, okay, let's skim. We see the definition there. We see the marking, okay, and then we look at the Safeguarding and Dissemination Authority. That's over by the purple arrow there. And now we only have one basic category. There are no subcategories or types listed. So we know that if we believe it to be controlled technical information and the information seems to qualify as controlled technical information, then we have one set of CUI safeguarding requirements that we have to meet, and that is the DFARS 252, 204, 7012. Now, that's a mouthful because there are lots of requirements compact into that defense contracting clause. And now we know those are the specified requirements that we have to meet for controlled technical information, and there aren't any others. But what happens if we have multiple categories of CUI, or we have information that we believe is another category of CUI? So now we have to look through the CUI registry and look at the information and compare the attributes of the information. If it's not properly marked, compare those attributes of the information to indicate what it might be. And in this case, that second set of information in our example, we believe it's export controlled information. But underneath export controlled information, we have both basic and specified requirements that we have to meet. And export controlled information has a lot of risk associated with it. The reason for that is because it's a very technical compliance regime that's 28 years old and it has a very robust and very egregiously punitive enforcement mechanism with the DDTC and the State Department. So we want to make sure that if we have export controlled information, we are getting it right. Because at $1 million, up to $1 million fines per instance, that's a very expensive proposition to get wrong. So as we navigate through export control information, if we believe that we have it, we want to ensure that we're meeting all the specific requirements related to that. Some of them may be basic requirements, which are common to all types of CUI. And then some of them may be specified requirements, which are unique to the types of export controlled information that we have. We have to meet both sets of those requirements. So again, we have to be aware of the category of information that we have and then be able to identify the basic and specified requirements that we have to meet. So now that we understand that we have to identify, does the CUI category or the information that we have or we believe that we have in our environment fit into this category? And then we have to further identify whether or not it has basic or specified requirements, because those are the security requirements. Now we have to dive into a little bit deeper. We've got to identify exactly what those security requirements are. So if we pivot from the basic or specified column over to the Safeguarding and Dissemination Authority, now we have to dive into what the 22 CFR Part 124.9 actually tells us that we have to do. Okay? And then as we dive into that information, now we understand exactly what is required for us to apply within our environment in order to meet the export control requirements related to that type of information. Okay. Well, why do we have to do that? Well, we have to do that because of the fact that in the Safeguarding and Dissemination Authority category within the CUI registry, that list of CUI requirements by definition includes those requirements that are levied on an information system that are derived from applicable laws, executive orders, directives, policies, standards, instructions, regulations, or procedures, or organizational mission business cases to ensure the confidentiality of the CUI being processed, stored, or transmitted. So we have to be able to go from the type of information that we have into the category of CUI, into the subcategory type, if that's applicable, that's listed in the CUI registry, identify the basic and specified requirements, and then look into the Safeguarding and Dissemination Authority and look up those requirements and know exactly what we must apply to that category of information. The reason why we call out export controlled information, again, is it's very technical, and you need people who have extensive experience in training within this category of information in order to get it right, because it is so punitive and it is so egregiously difficult. Okay, so this is a process, and it's a learned process, and it's going to take time for you to understand this, navigating step by step, but it is achievable. It is doable, but it has to be done. Now we're going to turn our attention back to controlled technical information and something a little bit simpler. So in controlled technical information, on the previous slide I told you that you only have one specified requirement that you have to meet, but it was a mouthful, right? There are lots of other things that you have to do within the 48 CFR 252, 204, 7012. Now if you're wondering, well, I thought that was the DFARS clause. Well, the 48 CFR provides the authority for the DFARS clause. But don't forget that within the DFARS clause, there are lots of things that you have to do, okay? And included within those requirements, we've listed out just 4 of the major ones. One of them is that you have to implement NIST 800-171. That's a specified requirement in the DFARS clause. You have to apply DoD policy because 32 CFR 2002-12-14 says that you have to, all right? And of course, as part of the DoD machine, of course, DoD policy applies to its DoD contractors and its subcontractors. If there are any other types of CUI within your environment, then you obviously have to meet those specified requirements as well. DoD policy says that, and so does the 32 CFR says you have to do that as well. And of course, you also have to meet your cyber incident reporting requirements. That's an inherent part of the safeguarding requirements underneath the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause, and that is certainly a specified requirement. So these are the 4 major things that you have to do, but they don't include everything. And you need to read that clause word for word, because within that clause, it will tell you exactly what you have to do, and you have to meet all the requirements in order to implement those and for them to operate as intended and produce the desired outcome. So safeguarding, once we identify what the CUI is and we understand that we have controlled technical information, these are the major requirements that we have to implement in order to meet our safeguarding responsibilities. So why do I have to do this? Well, I have to do it because I've gone through the process in the CUI lifecycle of identifying the CUI, and now I understand my responsibilities in safeguarding the CUI, but I cannot share CUI unless the recipients meet certain requirements. And underneath my responsibilities for safeguarding covered defense information, I have to meet the 32 CFR 2002. That establishes the CUI program and all the requirements related to our agreements, all the way down from the DoD, all the way down to the lowest tier subcontractor. And so that requirement underneath 32 CFR 200216 establishes something called reasonable expectation. And I, as an authorized holder, have to have a reasonable expectation that all of the intended recipients are authorized to receive CUI and have a basic understanding on how to handle it. And also, I have to, my responsibilities underneath 32 CFR 200214C, I have to protect CUI underneath my control. And that means, as an authorized holder, or as our organization being an authorized holder, that we have to take reasonable precautions in order to guard against the unauthorized disclosure of CUI. And the 32 CFR 200 defines what those reasonable precautions are. So these are the things that we must do. And we have to establish, number one, a controlled environment to protect the CUI from unauthorized access or disclosure, or make use of controlled environments. Number two is that we have to reasonably ensure that unauthorized individuals cannot access or observe CUI or overhear conversations discussing CUI. Number three is that we have to keep CUI underneath the authorized holder's direct control or protect it with at least one physical barrier. And number four is we have to protect the confidentiality of CUI that's within our covered contractor information system and protect it implementing the security controls and requirements related to NIST 800-171. So as a authorized holder, I have gone through the process in the CUI lifecycle of identifying the CUI, identifying the requirements to safeguard the CUI and the CMC practices that we have to implement. And then the reason why I'm doing this is because I cannot share CUI either within my organization or outside my organization unless I've met these four prerequisites for preventing the unauthorized disclosure of CUI. As we understand our responsibilities for safeguarding CUI throughout the entire life cycle, we recognize the fact that the CUI category determines the CUI security requirements, and those are identified in the CUI registry. And then our understanding of the CUI security requirements allows us to identify and determine the controls that we need to implement within our environment in order to safeguard the CUI and meet the requirements. Because the definition for CUI security controls includes the management, operational, and technical controls, either safeguards and countermeasures, that prescribe for an information system to protect the confidentiality of the system and the CUI information. Further, if we look at AC 3.1.12, we look at the fact that security controls are defined as the safeguards and countermeasures organizations implement to satisfy CUI security requirements. So that we see the interconnectedness between these definitions. So, once again, we understand that CUI security requirements are determined by the CUI category, and when we understand those requirements, now we look at to determine the controls that we have to implement at the management, operational, and technical controls. This relationship between CUI security requirements and the definition of CUI security controls provides us the foundation for understanding what our responsibilities are for safeguarding CUI and getting it right the first time. Now let's take a look at applying what we learned here towards the 5 principles of safeguarding CUI. So now let's do a quick refresh on the 5 principles for safeguarding CUI. Number 1 is that we want to identify all CUI and determine the requirements. Number 2 is that we understand the CUI security requirements. Number 3 is that we apply the CUI security controls or CMC practices to our environment. Remember, that's the process, that's the environment that processes, store, or transmits CUI, and that's the environment that either receives or develops CUI in performance of the contract, right? Per the definition of covered defense information. And when we implement those controls or the CMC practices, we have to implement them correctly. And they have to operate as intended, and they have to produce the desired outcome. What is the desired outcome? The desired outcome is number 4, that we satisfy or meet the CUI security requirements that we identified in the first 2 steps. Okay. Now imagine for a moment that we spent the last 18 or 24 months inside of our company, and we've toiled, we've worked our way through the NIST 800-171. We've worked and developed all of these policies and these procedures, and the change is disruptive, and we've made changes to our business process, and we're managing the data, and we're doing what we need to do in the IT architecture, and made the changes, contracted the services, made some changes to our technologies that we're using to monitor or to do other requirements. And now, guess what? We haven't created the sufficient evidence to prove it. That is where all of this rests on. If we do not create the sufficient evidence to prove that we are doing it correctly, that it's implemented correctly, it's operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome, we haven't made the appropriate progress that we desire in order to meet the requirements in the expectations related to CMMC certification. And that is something that we have to pay close attention to, and we cannot overlook. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at applying everything that we've learned with the CUI Fundamentals course, and then the 5 principles for safeguarding CUI, and we're going to apply them into our environment. Within the CUI safeguarding lifecycle, what is it that we need to do to safeguard CUI in our daily operations and performance of the contract? How do we do that to protect the data? How do we do that to meet requirements? And then how do we do that in preparation for assessment or for audit? So that always begins, as we know, with the fact that we identified the CUI, we identified the categories of CUI, and that relationship to the CUI security requirements. Now we look at the CUI security controls that we need to implement inside of our environment, inside of our company, in order to what? Safeguard the CUI during our daily operations in performance of the contract. So we will take a look at our table here, and our table identifies the things that we need to do. We've got the CUI security requirements related to the NIST 800-171. We've got CUI security requirements and controls related to the DoD policy and federal policy. We already talked about the fact that we've identified if we have the different types of specified CUI. For example, we always start with controlled technical information, and the reason we do that is because that is our usual suspect within the DoD contract. There may be others, as we've talked about during this lesson, export control or many other categories of CUI, but it has to be directly related to the performance of the contract. And of course, one of the other major things that we need to do is prepare for cyber incident reporting. So this table represents a snapshot of the CUI security requirements, but not all of them. So we have to understand what the requirements are, and we have to identify the controls that we need to apply within our environment. With the CMC publications and the NIST publications, they require us to govern our environment through policies and procedures. Now, in the NIST 800-171, they're listed as NFO controls, and then CMC publications, they are directed through the CMC glossary and the definitions within what a policy is and what procedures are. And you need to be very familiar with both of those concepts as they are defined within the CMC publications, because they provide explicit guidance for what we need to do and what we need to include within those documents. Regardless, we have to do these things. And so what we do is we integrate and we apply the NIST 800-171 controls, the DoD policy, and the CMC publication guidance into our environment, and that's represented in how we write our policies and what our policies say. And that those policies and procedures guide us into what we need to do in order to safeguard CUI throughout the lifecycle in the performance of the contract. So our company policies say exactly what is required of us. And we know that we have to apply security controls at the management level, at the operational level, and at the technical level based on the definition of security controls that we talked about in just a couple previous slides ago. Now that we've identified in our company's policies and procedures what they expect us to do with regards to the management controls, the operational controls, and technical controls, now we begin to focus on implementation. So implementation includes those CUI security requirements that we have to meet, right? It also includes all the controls that have to be implemented as directed by the company policies and incorporated into the procedures that we do every single day in order to satisfy the CUI security requirements. So we remember that we're applying those controls at the management and the operational technical levels in the way that we do business. So as we're implementing, we're looking at and applying these things to where does the CUI flow in our business process? Where does the CUI flow in our IT network and our architecture? How do we need to make the appropriate changes to meet the requirements that are expected of us? We have to also focus on the fact that the controls have to function and they have to operate as intended. And we always have to monitor what we do, and we have to be able to ensure that what we are requiring of us in our company policies and what we are requiring of us as a company in our procedures, in our daily operations, is being monitored and is being enforced. At the end of the day, remember that the purpose of the monitoring enforcement is to ensure that the policies and the procedures that implement the requirements and address the controls are producing the desired outcome. Now that's when we turn our attention to operations. Operations is our daily operations as a result of the fact that we've established the policies that govern CUI. Those policies direct us to do very certain things in order to meet requirements. And out of those policies, we develop procedures to guide our people and guide our employees in their activities that are authorized to do with lawful government purpose according to the scope of their duties in the performance of the contract in order to satisfy the requirements. The really important aspect of procedures is that the procedures carry us through our day-to-day operations. Just like when you have a procedure to make a widget or you have a procedure to do a specific activity, we want those activities and those procedures to be seamlessly integrated with our responsibilities on safeguarding CUI. So we need them to have the sufficient detail to both meet the safeguarding requirements and for us to do our job. So that sufficient detail has to be incorporated into procedures, and so that I, as a trained individual, can execute the requirements based on the guidance of those procedures. And of course, those procedures are monitored and they're enforced by our supervisors and by the management and the operational controls that we need to do during the execution of the contract. Never forget that the procedures themselves are evidence, but they're only evidence if during the interview and exam and test portions of the assessment that the employee can actually execute the procedure as it is written, right? We can't have a differentiation between what a procedure says and what an employee knows and what an employee does. We want these things to be seamlessly integrated for the purposes of safeguarding the CUI for sure, for the purposes of the execution of the contract because we're running a business here, but also for the fact that we train as we execute and we execute as we test and we test as we certify. So now this takes us to our next big step, which is to ensure that we have evidence, and that evidence is important to the daily assessment of these activities and to our maturity as an organization in order to prepare for assessment either by a prime contractor, assessment by the government, the Defense Contract Management Agency, or assessment for the purposes of certification. We have to ensure that we have evidence that demonstrates the fact that our policies with the stated requirements and the procedures are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome. We're back at the beginning of our cycle, and we're focused on identifying the CUI security requirements and applying those controls. And that's a continuous cycle, right? As we acquire and are awarded new contracts, as the scope of our contract changes, as the products and the services that we provide narrow or widen, we go back through this continuous process through the entire period of certification during the performance of the contract to ensure that the requirements are met as our business process changes, as the products and services change, and as we get our way throughout the performance of the contract. Now we're going to apply the 5 principles of safeguarding CUI to our responsibilities in the other aspects of the CUI lifecycle. Because once we've identified CUI and we've identified the requirements to safeguard that CUI and we've implemented the controls within our environment, now we're in the position that we, according to the requirements, can share CUI internally to our organization and externally throughout our suppliers and subcontractors, because we have to have a reasonable expectation that they are ready, understanding of their requirements, and then also that they are compliant with those requirements as well, as we've talked about in the previous slides. So that remember, that impacts us both internally and externally. So now that we've met these requirements and we have reasonable expectation within our organization and externally to our organization, we can share CUI and ensure that those requirements are met and the CUI is safeguarded. Last, now we're going to focus on decontrolling CUI. We're going to touch on this very briefly because this is a class entire of its own. There are basically three dispositions for CUI that can take place. One is that it's destroyed. The other one is that it's approved for public release. And some contracts require the indefinite archiving of the material or archiving of the material for a certain given period of time. The DoD policy that governs that process is DoD I-5248. Again, we'll focus on this in specific detail in another lesson. In summary, let's talk about the 5 principles of safeguarding CUI and what we've learned today. Number 1 is that we identify all the CUI and determine the requirements, and that we have to understand those CUI security requirements in order to apply them in the context of our business environment within our policies and procedures. And our policies and procedures guide us on what we need to do in order to ensure that the security controls and the CMC practices are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome. Last is that we have the evidence to prove it, and that evidence is produced through our policies, through our procedures, through the activities related to the implementation of those procedures and the operation of those procedures, right? The monitoring and the enforcement of those procedures all produce the relevant evidence to prove the fact that the CUI security requirements are satisfied as per our obligation with the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause. I hope that this lesson has provided some insight and some guidance for you to be able to apply the 5 principles for safeguarding CUI throughout the CUI lifecycle in a practical way, right? How do we actually transfer that knowledge and begin to implement that within our environment, within the context of our business? And then using these as a point of navigation to keep us on track as we move through the implementation, the operations, and in preparation for our assessments, whether that be on a daily basis, whether that be in preparation for a government audit, or, of course, for CMMC certification as well. Now, at this point, you've learned a lot in a little bit of time, and I want you to know that you got to be patient with yourself, and you got to realize that you're not going to absorb all the material and all the information in a single setting. The consistent exposure to this information, and that's the reason why we develop these lessons where they reinforce the principles of previous lessons so that you can expose yourself to the requirements, that you can understand them, and you can be able to implement them in a practical way. So if you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out to contact us. We are very grateful for the opportunity to guide you throughout this process and to help you understand these requirements and help you to be successful in your journey to meet these requirements and eventually to certify. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.